I'm Scott Kiloby, and I'm the director and co-founder of the Kiloby Center for Recovery, which is, you could say it's a non-dual based or mindfulness-based, depending on how you phrase that. It's a addiction, depression, anxiety treatment center. So it's really, as far as we know, it's the first mindfulness-based treatment center, completely mindfulness-based center in the U.S., although it's been done, I think, in different countries. It's really the first one here. So we're in Palm Springs, California, and we're treating people every day for those things, including trauma that comes with addiction, using the approach that I developed in my book, Natural Rest for Addiction, and the part of that book called The Living Inquiries, which is a form of self-inquiry. There's a lot of other things that we do at the center, including yoga, energy and body work, some DBT, things like that, but it's mainly centered around the presence work and the inquiries. Being a drug addict for so many years, 20 years, and then getting clean, what I recognized almost immediately is that the seeking was still there. So whatever that seeking impulse that was there my whole life around drugs and alcohol, it certainly did not go away simply because I took the drugs and alcohol away. And you know, and it turned towards a lot of different things, other addictions, but ultimately spiritual seeking. But then recognizing that non-dual awareness really shifted something tremendously for me. And I think at that point I was teaching some and sharing with people and writing books, but it really wasn't on the forefront of my agenda to really work with people on addiction. However, I was just noting in my own life that my addictions were starting to fall away through the self-inquiry, more like a kind of a gradual falling away of things. And I was taking note of that, knowing that one day I would definitely want to help people with addiction, but I hadn't formulated the words and the methodology for it, so that took some time. And it really was quite a natural progression. I mean, we developed the living inquiries, we meaning myself and other facilitators that I've trained, and we started to work with people just in one-on-one session and finding that it was definitely helpful for not only the addictive urges, but the anxiety that goes with it, the childhood and other trauma that's under it, sometimes the depression or other things that's connected to it. It was just a natural extension to start using the inquiries to help people in that area. So the work became less about sort of speaking to just spiritual seekers, whatever that is, and more to the people in the general public who were not finding the freedom in their life through other programs. You know, 12-step works really well for some people, and then for others it doesn't. There's a vast amount of people out there for whom it hasn't worked. And because addiction is so dangerous, I mean, you can literally lose your life or your job or your whatever else, it just seemed important to bring it out to people and say there is a different way. I mean, you know, to bring the non-dual elements into it without, and then there's a lot of caveats in that, because there's a lot of kind of human issues that have to be dealt with, and people can get, we'll save that for later, but there's just a lot of caveats with bringing non-duality into the addiction realm because of untreated or unresolved trauma or other issues that have to be examined for people. I mean, yeah, it's a great question. If I would say, in just the non-dual terms, it is the sense of being separate. I mean, it is not just the mind's notion of being a separate self, but to me it's a very physical experience. It was a very physical experience of being separate. And along with the sense of separation was like a deep core restlessness. For me it manifested, and I don't think that I'm different than a lot of other people, it just mine went to drugs and alcohol. But it manifested as not being able to sort of be in my own skin and to be comfortable in the moment as it is. It was always just sort of to the next thing, to the next thing. So, you know, I don't have the scientific formula to say what it is. I can only tell you from my experience, it's definitely wrapped up into the experience of feeling separate and the core restlessness that comes from that. The more that I work with people who are addicted, the more that I see that they are, that really the addiction is like a survival mechanism that doesn't have a shut-off valve. So just as we had to know where the berries were or where the bison were in order to survive many, many years ago, we had to remember that. Our systems had to remember that and compel us back to the food in order to survive, or sex, or whatever. It's like the brain gets hijacked and it just compels us towards the wine or the caffeine or the internet or the porn or the sex in the same exact way, from the same fundamental feeling of restlessness, of that feeling of needing to survive. So it's an unfortunate thing about being human, is that there's no shut-off valve for that. It's not like we get our food, we get our shelter, we get our necessities, and then the brain goes, okay, quiet now. It just tends to kind of go and go and go, and for some people more than others, obviously. Not everybody's addicted into the same degree as other people. But. You know, to me it's been like, you know, the main thing is when I was spiritual seeking, it was about a question of who am I? Am I these thoughts and the emotions that are connected to them? So the first sign of the seeking towards awakening, or towards the question of identity, that was extinguished. So the spiritual seeking just ended, and it has never come back since then. I've never longed to know who I am. I know what I am, you know. But the body, in a way, has its own say around other things. You know, in other words, the body, it wasn't just like a clean break where everything, all seeking in all forms, ended. It was like the spiritual seeking ended, but then there were strands of sex addiction for me, caffeine, some food addiction, tobacco. Those things had their own sort of shelf life, and you know, I feel like there's not a lot you can do through willpower to truly extinguish those strands, but you can by resting as awareness, by resting in what you are and using a little skillful inquiry, you can kind of untangle the knots of those things slowly over time, and then they just sort of dissipate. So it's been a process of, I always explain it like tears, like, yeah, there's the question of who am I that's been settled, and then there's the drugs and alcohol that have been settled, like I don't feel that fear of going on painkillers again. And so that's kind of been settled. And there were then the caffeine fell away, and then, you know, the tobacco, and then the sex addiction fell away. And then, you know, there's the email or the text. I mean, our whole society is like built around that, but it's just gotten quieter and quieter and quieter and quieter, you know, over time as the natural progression of it. It's not a clean break, though. It's not like I had an experience and then everything just, it wasn't like that for me. Creativity is the one thing that I love. I mean, I love about life. Having the center is really about creating. You know, we created our own model, we created our own center, and then we're growing and being a musician and creating all my life. So I understand the creative impulse. I don't understand it, but I love the creative impulse. And that seems very natural, the creative drive to grow and evolve and what we're doing as humans. But yeah, it does, it gets hooked up in these other things, like these repetitively going back to these temporary pleasurable states that we get that really aren't so much about creating or evolving. They're about sort of being hung up on trying to cope with some feelings that are uncomfortable, or, you know, cope with the restlessness. Yeah, so it's an interesting conversation because we don't want to extinguish that natural impulse to create, because it's really, it's why I love living, you know. You know, a lot of people don't even know to inquire from that place when they first get there. So all they're concerned with is, how do I get off the drugs and alcohol or whatever else, or how do you help me with my anxiety? And simple mindfulness and a few good skills can help them with that. But then we start to talk to them about, but look at what the core issue really is. I mean, and in some sense, everybody's asking the question, who am I, even if they're not conceptualizing it, because they're looking in the world for themselves, in other people, in praise, acknowledgement, attention, you know, the next boyfriend, the next house, the next car, the next promotion, whatever it is. They're really asking the question, who am I? And so we just show them that they have been asking that question through their life and they've not found the answer to it. And so usually they'll come at some level really wanting to know, well then who am I? If they stay long enough, they'll get to that question. But it's not a question that we introduce like right after detox, or, you know, when they have other practical concerns, you know, just how can I stay clean today? That's the number one thing. And then how can I deal with these feelings, you know? And that's where the mindfulness and the resting comes in. And then, you know, what do I do with all these thoughts? And what do I do with my mother who's triggering me all the time? Those are, you know, very palpable everyday issues. But then it often does get down to that final question for people who hang with it long enough. But not everybody does, because people often want to go back out into the world and into the seeking game. Yes, that's a really great question. It's one thing I want to talk about at the conference, is not only people who are on the path seeking, because if it's like, for me it was the same impulse. It was like drugs, alcohol. I remember stopping drugs and alcohol when I was like 22 for, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks, which is as long as I'd ever stopped. And as soon as I stopped, this desire for spiritual awakening arose. It's just like it was taking its place. And then as soon as I started back on the drugs, the desire for the spiritual awakening died down. So yes, I see a lot of people who are seeking awakening and enlightenment, who, and not everyone, but who have maybe secretive little addictions that they don't talk about, or you know, sex or porn addiction, or maybe they drink much more caffeine than they would like anybody to know, or that they can't get off the internet for hours, or that they're looking desperately for someone to love them almost in an addictive way. All those things are going on as part of that impulse, and that's exactly what I experienced, you know, and why I was explaining how the tears kind of fall away, you know, as you go deeper. But another thing I wanted to say is that even people who have had a definite shift, they are not immune at all to not only the addiction, but the trauma that drives it. And so one of the things I want to talk about at the conference is not to be so sure that once you've kind of had a shift into that awareness that all that stuff, I mean, people will say, well, it just goes on and doesn't matter anymore. But it does matter for people. For example, I just talked to an individual who has had a shift and who is really in a desperate state right now because of an addiction that has grabbed hold of his life, you know. So that's what I want to talk about, is that having the shift is almost just like the beginning, the context of being able to examine these things if you're open. That is this what excites me, is that conversation. That's the conversation that excites me. It doesn't excite me that much to talk about the initial shift, because it can happen, and it's happening for more and more people. And we're getting very skilled at helping people with that. But the work that comes after, and the way that things show up after, is really, to me, where the whole point of it is. And just to talk about my own journey, I grew up gay in Indiana, very anti-gay area. And at about age 6, I was an athlete, and the other boys in the group recognized that I was different. And as soon as they did, you know, I was really bullied badly, and just hid from them for 2 months and didn't go to school, hid in my room. And then of course my addiction started not long after that. And then I became a seeker, and I was addicted to drugs and all the story that I told you. But then after the shift, I realized that trauma had really never been dealt with. And that's why I've been kind of forced into this conversation, is to recognize that this is what has happened for me. And my body had stored a lot of energy in different areas, almost like it was in survival or fight, flight, freeze mode. And without dealing with that, my body couldn't open to this completely. It's like the body kept saying no. No, you got to protect yourself. So yeah, that's the deepening, is to be, for me, is to be open to that and to encourage other people to be open to it. I think maybe for some people it does fall away that way. And it has, everybody is so different. If someone, I mean, there are monks and other people who did lots of purification techniques and stuff before the shift, and when they shift there's not a lot of stuff, or maybe a shift is so profound that there's not a lot of stuff. But frankly, I don't buy much of that, because when I look at some of the people who claim that, and I know one particular teacher, without naming names, made that claim, and then the people around him were trying to do an intervention on him for a certain addiction. And I'm thinking, you know, let's talk honestly about this. You know, let's open this conversation up. But the one thing I think that people are afraid to talk about is because the seeking thing. The idea that if you talk about this stuff, people will then seek that. But the shift itself provides a restful context to look at everything, so that it's no longer about seeking, it's about discovery and openness, being open to this stuff when it comes up. Not so much with the impulse to get somewhere else later, but to be with it as it arises. And if you talk about it that way, it's really part of the recognition of your true nature. And in any event, if you don't look at it, it comes to get you. It will bite you in the ass. Even whether you may not realize it, but the people around you know it. They know because of how you react. They know because of how because you're still addicted to that, or because you're in your head all the time trying to avoid something. Everybody, we all have that sense about people who have not taken it deeply. So you can be a teacher who ignores this conversation, but the people around you will remind you in one way or the other that you haven't looked at your stuff. In the end, it's everybody's, I don't want to say choice, but it's everybody's sense of how deep they're going to take something. And there's always going to be this conversation about, is it, do you recognize your true nature and it's all over, or is there a deepening? I think everybody has to come to their own recognition. I would just say that pay attention to what's going on in your body and your mind. Pay attention to your reactions to people. Pay attention to how you're compulsive around things. Pay attention to how you're anxious in certain situations. I mean, life is showing you your trauma all the time if you just pay attention. And you can say, though, that's just part of the true nature and it's going to unfold gradually. Well, let's hope it does. We have no proof that it does, because there are very, very elaborate ways of keeping it from dissolving. You know, one way is just to continue going towards the addiction. Then you will just avoid the repressed emotion. So if I say, I've recognized my true nature and this addiction that I have to sweets is just going to naturally fall away. We don't know that until it does fall away. And as long as you're reaching for that, you're actually keeping down the emotion that's repressed. So just pay attention. I think it is, but it's almost like we get a pass on that one, because it's, well, it depends. This reaching for the absolute was really the saving grace for me. You know, without knowing, the possibility of recognizing this awareness was the thing that really saved me. And I did all the seeking like everybody else did until I deconstructed all that. Yeah, I mean, I think it can be if you're chasing a concept, or if you're chasing a state or an experience, and you think that the absolute must look and feel like this, then you're naturally going to seek that. But if you start to recognize that it is what's aware now and that everything is arising within it, and then I think the seeking for that can die. But that's true of all addictions. You know, it's like if you think your happiness is outside in the donut or the crack, you'll continue to do that. But once you start to deconstruct that, and you find out you have everything, you have this peace within you already, you have this contentment within you already, then the seeking dies. I mean, I think it's true of everything, the absolute or a donut, you know, like in a sense. Much more fulfillment in what I'm doing now. I can't say that there was a conscious choice, but there was more like a gradual recognition that the way that I was talking about this wasn't working for me. And one of the first things, so yes, I was a teacher giving talks, but what I was doing every day is individual sessions all day, every day for years. And in those individual sessions, you really get a sense of what's going on for people in a way that you can't always get in a talk, because you don't really get time with people. And slowly I started to notice that, yeah, the person's seeking enlightenment, but what they really do is they believe that they're deficient, or that there's this trauma, and they're trying as hard as they possibly can not to examine it, not to bring it up in their consciousness, and that all of the stuff that they're seeking is really just one attempt not to have to deal with that. And so, I thought, well, this is really, this work is really as much about these human issues as it is about the awareness. It is about the awareness, but it's also about these very human issues. And if you can direct the teaching to, or the methodology to those issues without losing the non-dual part of it, then it's going to be much more holistic. It's going to work on more levels. So much more fulfilling to me. Mainly because the main reason is because when I was giving those talks, I would, or talking to spiritual seekers who had been to talks or retreats, they would say, wow, I was at the retreat last weekend and I felt that limitless, whatever. And I'm crashing now. And then they would say, and there's nobody here to help. The teacher is gone. The retreat is over. And it was really, really, I saw some very painful experiences for people. There's nothing wrong with the satsang model, because it's great that people can go and do those retreats and talks. But I wanted to be in an atmosphere where you could give people more ongoing support through all the ups and downs and the experiences and the crashes, to show them the stability through all of that, instead of, so that's where I knew it was going. But then it wasn't until we were able to open the center that we could do it.